All right, we're live on Facebook. I think we're live on the site too.
Terrific. Get started here in just a few minutes. Just a little over
A minute, yeah. By the way, if you got a Bible, we're going to be in Numbers chapter 17. This is the text for the message from yesterday.
It was interesting, Zach. I was looking yesterday. So we've got about 3 weeks left of this Numbers series, which means this summer series is almost over. School is about to start here in a week. It's just flying by.
Yeah, time is it's moving at warp speed. This has been definitely an interesting season, but also a fast-moving one.
Well, folks, welcome to Isolation Bible Study. I'm Bill Tucker from Concordia in San Antonio. With me, Pastor Zach McIntosh, and it's good to be with you today. I'd encourage you, if you have the means to do so, invite somebody to join us. We're going to be talking about Numbers 17 and referencing the message that Pastor Steve Wagner preached yesterday, and we'd love to have folks join us. If you're watching on Facebook, it's easy to do. All you have to do is like and share. And by the way, we say like and share because when you like the video, it increases the visibility to other people, it expands the reach of the video. When you share it, it does the same thing, but it also puts it on your page so people who are scrolling through have a greater chance of seeing it and maybe being able to join in, whether they join in now or at some point in the future, because the recording, of course, remains there. And these recordings stay on the Concordia site as well. So our practice on Mondays during this summer series, working our way through the book of Numbers, has been to circle back and then talk about some points that we weren't able to get to. Now, yesterday, you and I didn't preach. We've been doing this tag team thing. Pastor Steve preached, and it was really kind of a special message, not just because he preached a great sermon about number 17, but it was also special because it was his last kind of formal preaching engagement here at Concordia since he and Rita retired on the 31st of July. And so special time, a special opportunity. One of the things that we're planning to do to honor those two great servants of God is to recognize them, and hopefully a little later on in the fall, as more people are coming back to worship. And by the way, it was terrific yesterday to see more folks. People are becoming more comfortable. I think they're becoming more determined to figure out how to make all of this work. We continue to do all of the things to make it as safe as possible. And so that's a wonderful blessing. It was really exciting. But then hopefully that'll play into the opportunity to celebrate Pastor Steve and Rita, to celebrate Sally McBee, who also retired, to celebrate so many other folks, and to celebrate former vicar, now Pastor Paul Horstmeyer, who was also ordained yesterday. And so lots of things on the horizon. But getting back to my point, we're gonna kind of jump in and talk about some things from number 17 that we think are kind of interesting and maybe worth listening to.
Yeah, so Pastor Steve's kind of theme was how God chooses servants, and what I'll do is I'll just kind of read through the story real quickly. It's not a very long story, just so you kind of get a lay of the land. And in case you happen to miss it yesterday, if you happen to miss it, you can go back and watch the service on our Facebook page, also on our YouTube page, or on our live page at the Concordia website, concordia.cc. So go check it out. You'll be blessed by it. Here's the story. This is from Numbers 17, beginning at verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and get 12 staffs from them, one from the leader of each of their ancestral tribes. Write the name of each man on a staff. On the staff of Levi, write Aaron's name." And by the way, Aaron is the brother of Moses. "For there must be one staff for the head of each ancestral tribe. placed them in the tent of meeting, which is the tabernacle. This is the place where the Israelites believed that God dwelled, in front of the Ark of the Covenant law. And the Ark of the Covenant was this box where the Israelites believed God was enthroned, where I meet with you, God says. The staff belonging to the man I choose, in other words, the servant that I choose, his staff is going to sprout. And then I'm going to rid myself of this constant grumbling against you by the Israelites, because one of the things the Israelites had been doing is they'd been getting into little turf wars, saying, "Hey, why does God choose this person to do this task and not choose me to do this task?" There was a little bit of jealousy and a little bit of envy running through the Israelite community. And so Moses placed the staffs before the Lord in the tent of the covenant law. The next day, this is verse 8, Moses entered the tent and saw that Aaron's staff, which represented the tribe of Levi, had not only sprouted, but budded, blossomed, and produced almonds. And this is how Moses and all of Israel knew that God had chosen Aaron and his tribe to serve as spiritual leaders or priests before him. And so this is kind of God confirming his choice of Aaron and the tribe of Levi being priests. And so we just want to talk a little bit today about why God chooses and about how God chooses servants to do his work.
Well, and it's just the story in itself is pretty amazing. Talk about definitive answers, for that staff, that for all intents and purposes, dead piece of wood to bring forth flowers and fruit is truly miraculous. And it reminds me how God does that day after day, week after week, year after year with dead pieces of wood like us, that he bears fruit in for the sake of the gospel.
Yeah, there is nothing that God can't do, including there's nothing that God can't do with us. And sometimes we forget that. We kind of look at the miracles, right? God parts a Red Sea or he rains down bread from heaven. Well, you are a walking miracle. That God does things with you in and of itself really is an incredible thing. And it's something we ought to recognize and be thankful for. And so we have three additional points, for the kind of in addition to what Pastor Steve talked about yesterday, that have to do with God's choice. And the first point that we want to spend just a couple of moments reflecting on is this: that God's choice is gracious. God's choice is gracious. Now, to get at this point, I'll just begin by setting a little bit of context. I mentioned that the Israelites were grumbling about the way that God was choosing people to do his
By the way,
work. And
they grumble throughout the book of Numbers.
yeah,
That's kind of a main theme, right?
they don't just grumble about how God chooses people. They grumble about not having water. They grumble about not having food. They grumble about being in Egypt. They grumble about being out of Egypt. They grumble about being in the wilderness. And then when they get into the promised land, they grumble that they're out of the wilderness. They'll always find something to complain about. But in this particular instance, they're grumbling about the way that God chooses people. And if you go to number 16, you read the story of a man named Korah. And Korah basically comes to a rally against Moses and Aaron. In fact, this is number 16, verse 3. And they say to Moses and Aaron, "The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" And here's kind of their basic point. Why do we need spiritual leaders? God has chosen us all. Why would God choose anyone to kind of be his special spiritual leader? Aren't we all special? And they get mad that God is choosing someone to do something and not choosing them. Now, here's what they miss. Okay? They miss that Korah, okay, and his clan, they don't deserve to be chosen by God to be spiritual leaders. But here's the secret. Neither does Aaron and his clan. Neither does any of us. The story of the Bible is a story of God constantly choosing people to do amazing things. God chooses Abraham to be the father of a great nation. Well, why didn't God choose somebody else? Or God chooses Moses to lead the nation of Israel out of slavery. Well, why didn't God choose someone else? God chooses Jonah to go and preach to a city of Nineveh, and Jonah wishes that God would have chose,
Exactly.
someone else. God chooses 12 men who are not always the brightest bulbs on the Christmas tree, to be his disciples. Well, why doesn't God choose someone else? Well, here's the thing: God doesn't have to choose anyone. The fact that God chooses someone to do something is miraculous in and of itself, which means that if we recognize that, it's God's grace that is operative in his choosing, it's not that God is saying, well, I really like him more than her or her more than him, and that's why I'm going to choose this person and not that person. It doesn't work that way. It's that God chooses certain people to do certain things. And so one of the things that we should be thankful for is that God chooses us to do anything. It does us no good to look at someone else and go, well, why did God choose them for that and me for this? The fact that God chose Korah to be one of the people who was led out of slavery in Egypt, that should have been a wonderful choice that Korah rejoiced in because it's a product of God's grace. But when we compare God's choice of us to God's choice of someone else, what is aroused in us often is jealousy, and we forget that the fact that we're chosen at all is a product of God's grace.
Well, and that takes us back to a message just a couple of weeks ago. God doesn't appreciate jealousy or envy because he knows that envy destroys us. It tears us apart and it separates us from him.
And so this actually leads us to one of the ways that God chooses us, which is he chooses us to be his children or to be his family, to be his sons, his daughter, his people. And so the Apostle Paul actually talks about this at the beginning of Ephesians, where he talks about, this is Ephesians 1, at the very end of verse 4, in love, he predestined us. Now, that's a fancy word, but here's what it means. It means he chose us. He chose us for adoption to sonship and daughtership through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. And then notice why. To the praise of his glorious, and here's the key word, grace, which he's freely given us. The reason that any of us are chosen to be followers of Jesus, okay, whether we're chosen to be followers of Jesus as a pastor, or whether we're chosen to be followers of Jesus as a father or a mother or a son or a daughter or a factory worker or a business executive, a CEO or a entry-level employee, the fact that we're chosen by God as his children to do any of those various things is all a product of grace. And so this should keep us from two things. It should keep us from jealousy, right? Why didn't God choose me to do the same thing that he's choosing you to do? But it should also keep us from arrogance, or basically, you go, well, God chose me because I am a little bit better than somebody else. God chose me based on my merit. No, he didn't. Remember, Aaron, he's chosen to be the high priest of Israel. This is after he leads Israel in the worship of a false god and a golden calf. Aaron had no good credentials to be a spiritual leader in Israel, which means the only reason he was chosen is not because he was better than anybody else, but because of grace.
Zach, the other thing that I think of when you talk about this, and especially when you talk about how God adopted us before the foundation of the world was laid, that's all grace. But it brings me then, if we fast forward to the next chapter, in chapter 2, where we talk about what grace is and how we're chosen by grace. We don't deserve it, we can't earn it, and yet God has created for us and for our individual lives a masterpiece plan. It's not like we say, well, God's grace chose him for something really cool and he's choosing me for something not so cool. If we're willing to look at it from God's perspective and willing to wait to perhaps see it from God's vantage point one day in eternity, every one of our lives is chosen for masterpiece living, not one for greatness and another for kind of slumming it. We are all chosen for masterpiece living.
And so I guess kind of the upshot, because God has chosen us for masterpiece living, because he's chosen us out of his grace, here's the best way to respond to God's choosing of you, simply by saying, thank you, God, right? Give him praise and glory. Don't look at somebody else and become jealous. Don't look at yourself and become arrogant. Just be humbly thankful because you're chosen by God. So God's choice is gracious. That's point one. Point two, God's choice is powerful. Now, here's the idea. You don't want to mess with what God has decided. Now, this comes out in actually a couple of different ways in the story, okay? It comes out kind of negatively in the life of Korah. Korah is jealous that God has chosen someone else to be the priestly clan of Israel. He's chosen Aaron to be the high priest and not him. And he comes to Moses with this complaint. Well, we're all good enough to do this. Why isn't God chosen us? So here's what happens to Korah. This is Numbers 16, verses 31 and 32. The ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their households, and all those associated with Korah, together with their possessions. That's serious judgment.
That's big time.
That's a powerful choice. And so here's the idea. If you go to God and you say, I don't care about your will, I don't care about your decisions, your decrees, your commands, your work, that has consequences. And that comes out over and over again in the Old Testament. But it hopefully should give us a little perspective to say, okay, I do need to listen to God.
Well, and Zach, it also takes us back to the message where we talked about envy, and we said, Miriam and Aaron were grumbling against Moses, and they were envious of his relationship with God, and God spoke to them. God stepped into the situation, and Miriam was left with leprosy, and she wasn't healed of that until Moses prayed and interceded for her. But it pointed out the fact God takes envy very seriously. He hates envy, and he's teaching a lesson. But Korah didn't get it. He didn't understand that God's not messing around. And now the consequence is massive. We think about lots of times, and even with our kids, we'll say, well, that's strike one, that's strike two. God's not playing around with this stuff because he knows both the physical and the spiritual and the emotional damage that these kinds of life practices, and envy is something that can become a life practice, the terrible devastation that wreaks in our lives.
Now, here's the thing. If this is where kind of the story ended, right, with God's power and judgment, that would just be, well, that'd be awful. Because then it's pretty much this, right? You better listen to me or else. But there's a really positive side to God's powerful choosing. And the positive side to God's powerful choosing comes out in the very next chapter. Because for the man who God has chosen to do this special work, what does he do? He takes a staff, right? And he does a miracle with it because, again, this is how powerful God's choice is. And so one of the things that we need to think through is this. If I reject God's choice will be powerful, but it won't be for my good. If I receive God's choice will still be powerful, but it will be for my blessing and for the blessing of so many other people around me. Here's kind of the way that I like to think through this. Jesus has this fabulous picture in John 15 where he talks about how he is the vine and we are the branches. He says this, I am the vine and you are the branches. Or another way to put this is, he's the trunk, okay? He's kind of the staff, the rod of Aaron. And we're like branches, buds, blossoms coming off that rod. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit, just like the staff of Aaron. But then he says this, apart from me, you can do nothing. In other words, when you live with me in my choice, in my will, in my desire, when you're connected to me, good grief, the possibilities are endless. But if you try to break off the branch from me, who is the vine, from me, who's the trunk, right? That staff of Aaron, the results are always going to be disastrous. And you're going to find yourself in places you don't want to be. And so Jesus' simple invitation is just stick with me because I want the power of my choice to produce fruit in your life to the blessing of other lives, rather than just creating a disaster because you buck my will or go against my choice.
Well, and that illustration really kind of brings to mind the idea there were 12 staffs there. We have no idea what they looked like, how fancy they were, how tall or how short some were, but they were all staffs and they all functioned. They could all serve a purpose, just like there are all kinds of people in our world with all kinds of gifts and talents and abilities and the opportunity to serve a purpose. But the thing is, none of that mattered when God's power became a part of the equation, because all of a sudden that staff was able to do something impossible. For that staff to not only flower, but to bring forth fruit was astonishing and beyond anyone's wildest imaginations. And that makes me think of Ephesians 3, where it talks about how God he puts his power at work within us, within the church, and within us as individual Christians, so that we can accomplish more than we can ask or even imagine. And so when you say that it's powerful, God's choice is powerful, yeah, that's an understatement, right? God's choice is miraculous and amazing.
And so the invitation here, right, is to receive God's choice. Because when you live in God's will, even if it's hard, even if it's scary, because I think that's one of the reasons that sometimes we kind of want to buck the system a little bit, is because we're scared of what we think God may have decreed. Even when it's frightening or even when it's not easy, his power promises to be at work in you. And you know what? It's a real simple equation, right? It's so much better to have his power at work in you than to have his power at work against you. And so to have his power at work in you is an incredible blessing. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So do we have time for a really funny
Yeah.
short story? So I may have told you this, I may have told the congregation this before, but when we were at the seminary, you know how when you're a Sem 4, so last year of seminary, before the placement, at least in the olden days when I was going through the seminary, if you were married, and Julie and I had gotten married midway through that Sem 4 year, the placement director has an interview with the pastor to be and his wife. And so Julie and I were talking about this interview, and we were practicing and rehearsing, and she was anxious, about what she was going to say. And one of the things that I had heard might be asked is, have you ever thought about being a foreign missionary? And so I said, have you ever thought about being a foreign missionary? And Julie said the question she was absolutely passionate about. Yes, I would love to do that. And I said, whoa, I don't know that we really want to do that. Be very careful. And I look back now over 30 years later, and we've been privileged to be involved in so many different ministries and so many different missions, and many of them foreign missions. It just makes me chuckle how God's choice is powerful. And it may be a little bit of a surprise to you.
Yeah. When I think about all the different places that she's gone, God answered her heart's desire in an amazing way. That's a great story. I love that. And so God's choice is gracious. God's choice is powerful. Here's the final one. And this one is just very precious to me. God's choice is persistent. In other words,
Thank goodness.
thank God. When we buck against God's choice, God keeps choosing us. So here's what happens with Aaron's staff that buds. This is number 17, verse 10. The Lord says to Moses, put Aaron's staff in front of the Ark of the Covenant to be kept as a sign to the rebellious. And so that's where Aaron's staff resides. It resides with the Ark of the Covenant, where the Israelites believed that God is enthroned. Now, here's the difficulty. Eventually, if we kind of go through a little bit of Bible history, eventually the Ark of the Covenant disappears. We don't know exactly when it disappeared or how it disappeared. Most scholars think that it disappeared when the Babylonians came in and conquered the nation of Israel and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was eventually housed, and they believe that they carried off the Ark of the Covenant. Well, for the Israelites, that would have been a disaster, because here's essentially what that would have symbolized to them: that they had been unchosen by God because of their rebellion. In fact, if you back up about 500 years earlier, there's this really interesting story in 1 Samuel 4. And if you haven't read it, it's a great story. It's where another group of people capture the Ark of the Covenant. This time it's not the Babylonians, but it's the Philistines. And when the Israelites hear that the Ark of the Covenant has been captured, there's this old priest named Eli, and he's so distraught that he falls backward in his chair, and then he passes away. But then he has a daughter-in-law. Her name she's the wife of Phinehas, who's one of Eli's sons. And when she hears that the ark has been captured, she's overcome with grief right in the middle of birth. And so she gives birth to a son, and there's this person there who's helping with the birthing process, and she tries to comfort this lady by saying, "Hey, don't despair. You've given birth to a son." But she still despairs, and she names the boy, this is just very jarring to me, Ichabod, which means the glory has departed, because that's the picture that the Israelites had. If they had the Ark of the Covenant, God was there. They were chosen. Once the Ark of the Covenant leaves, God's not there, and they're not chosen. And so in 586, when the Ark of the Covenant gets carried off, it was very clear to the Israelites what this meant. God's not there, and they're no longer chosen. But here's what they didn't quite understand: God's choice is persistent. Because the ark was God's presence with them. Well, God's presence comes to them again. But here's the problem: God wants to choose them, but they keep rejecting God's choice. If you go to the beginning of the Gospel of John, there's this great section in John 1 where it says that Jesus came to those who were his own, but his own didn't receive him. In other words, God wants to choose them again. He wants to come back to him again, and they reject him again. And yet, God's choice is persistent. Um, there's this great section in Matthew 27 where Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate. And it says that the governor's soldiers, they take Jesus into the praetorium. They gather the whole company of soldiers around him, and they strip him, and they put a scarlet robe on him, and they twist together a crown of thorns, and they set it on his head. And then what do? This is just really interesting picture. They put a staff in his hand, and they kneel in front of him, and they mock him, and they say to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him, and they take the staff and they strike him on the head again and again. Here's what they do. They use a staff to try to beat back God's choice, his chosen one, because Jesus is the ultimate high priest. He's the ultimate Aaron. He's the ultimate chosen one. But here's what they don't know. Here's what they don't see. That staff is getting ready to bud. Because even though it looks like death and lights out, 3 days later, it buds and it blossoms in new life. And so here's how we now know that God has chosen us. We don't need a staff because we have a cross. And so if you want to know if you're chosen, and if you want to know that you will continue to be chosen, even when kind of like Israel, you do all sorts of dumb things, look to the cross, because it's just an incredible picture that God chooses you even when you reject him again and again and again.
You know, when we were talking about the Israelites grumbling in the book of Numbers, their grumbling always is associated with rejecting God. They grumble, they envy, they have all of these things that happen, and that grumbling causes them to essentially say, we want Egypt again. We want the slavery. We want to go back to what we had before. And as you read the book of Numbers, you sort of begin to say, wow. I mean, don't they get the message? But the other side of that equation is, wow, God, don't you see that these people are absolutely impossible to deal with? And it goes to this idea that you've just laid out so beautifully, Zach, that God's choice is persistent. I know lots and lots of folks, and I'll bet there are folks who are part of this Bible study right now who have in the back of their mind the idea, God could never choose me. You know, maybe once upon a time, but I've done this. I've got this in my history. I've got this problem or this behavior, or God clearly isn't choosing me because I've got this struggle going on in my life. And dear friends, hear the words that Pastor Zach has just shared with you. God's choice of you is persistent. He doesn't give up. He doesn't stop. He is absolutely impossible to stop in his passion and his desire to bring you back to himself. There's no sin that you can commit. There is no attitude that you can have. There is no struggle in your life that can possibly separate you from God's love. You are his choice, so much so that he rejected his own son, turned his back on him, let him carry our sin and our brokenness in order to bring us back to himself. And in the darkest moments, when the devil is screaming in our ears about how we are not possibly worthy, we need to hold that cross. We need to see that cross. We need to recognize that is the staff that budded and bore fruit. That means we will never be rejected by God.
So there's this passage in Hebrews 9 that speaks to exactly what you're saying, what we're saying, where the preacher of Hebrews actually makes this real explicit connection. He begins in Hebrews 9 and he talks about the first covenant had regulations for worship. This is verse 1, and also an earthly sanctuary, and they set up a tabernacle. Okay. And then there was this really interesting thing that happened in the most holy place. Okay. Verse 4, the most holy place had a golden altar of incense. Okay. The gold covered Ark of the Covenant. And the ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, okay, the story that we're looking at today, and the stone tablets of the covenant. And so we have this tabernacle, okay, where the preacher of Hebrews is saying, we're all these incredible things. But the preacher of Hebrews continues, this is verse 11. When Christ came as kind of the new high priest of the good things that are now here, he went through a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with human hands. Okay, so it's not part of the creation, but he didn't enter through like the blood of a sacrifice of a goat or a calf, all those sacrifices they made in the Old Testament. But he did enter the most holy place, where like Aaron's rod was, once and for all by his own blood, thus obtaining, and then catch this phrase, eternal. In other words, it's very persistent. It goes on forever. Eternal redemption. And so the place where Aaron's staff once sat, Jesus is there now saying, I choose you. And it's eternal.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful point. Folks, I hope if you've heard nothing else, I hope this last point sinks into your heart and into your mind, because it's one of those things that in difficult times, and we're living in a difficult time, it's so easy to get worn down, to get run down, to become weary, and to lose track of the truth. And the truth is, you are passionately and desperately loved by God, and nothing can change that. So trust him and turn to him and talk to him and dig into his word. Zach, great study. Thank you for leading us through this today. This is Isolation Bible Study, and we will be back with you on Wednesday. But we hope that you've been blessed. Have a great day. God bless you.